With today's lesson, we're going to learn how to factor trinomials when a equals 1. To understand this, we should talk about the standard form for a quadratic trinomial. Again, as we learned before, that is ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. So for a to be 1, that would mean that the number in front of x squared should be 1. Or you should just have an x squared or a squared or k squared, whatever variable it might be. So for this method to work, that number in front of x squared must be 1. So to factor, really what we're doing is foiling backwards, or we're kind of unfoiling. So when we were foiling, we'd normally start with 2 parentheses. So to factor or unfoil, we're going to end up with 2 parentheses. And to do this, you have to look at first term for the first 2 spots. So what times what gives me x squared? Well, x times x. So these first 2 spots in our parentheses come from the first term. The last 2 spots come from the last term. So I have to think to myself, what times what equals that last term, 21? So I can make a little list over here on the side, and I can think, what times what equals 21? Well, I can go 1 times 21. I could think 3 times 7. I could think negative 3 times negative 7, or even negative 1 times negative 21. Right, so I have my positives and I have my negatives that all equal a positive 21 when I multiply them. And then the last step, we have to decide, well, which one of these factor pairs do I want to use to complete my factoring here. So to do that, I got to look at the middle term. All right, so the middle term is going to be negative 10. So I'm coming over here to look at which of these factor pairs will equal negative 10. And that is negative 3 and negative 7. Alright, so my middle term was negative 10. And adding all these up, I got 22, 10, negative 10, and negative 22. The negative 3 and negative 7 add up to give me that negative 10, that middle term. Alright, so just to make a little note here, when factoring for our last 2 spots, we got to think of what multiplies to get C and adds up to get B. So again, my standard form was ax squared plus bx plus c. So what times what gives me that 21, but adds up to give me my negative 10. Alright, let's do another example. I have n squared minus n minus 90. Well, the first thing I have to do is make my 2 parentheses. Right? So for every trinomial, when a is 1, we're going to have 2 parentheses. The first 2 spots come from the first term. So these first 2 spots right here come from the n squared. So I got to think, what times what gives me n squared? Well, n times n. And then I got to think, the last 2 spots come from this last term right here, so I can make a list. What times what gives me 90? But because we're factoring, I got to think, what times what gives me a negative 90, because it's a minus 90, and then also adds up to be negative 1. Alright, so I can make a list and go through, and the first thing I think of with 90 is 9 times 10, and then for this to be a negative 90, I have to make one of these negative. So maybe the negative 9. But when that adds up, that gives me a positive 1. So that's not going to work. But I can switch the sign, so this would be positive 9 and a negative 10. And when that when I add those together, I'm going to have -1. So in this column, this is my last term. And in this column, I'm just adding them up. That's my sum. So the factor pair I'm going to choose for this is going to be 9 and -10. So a +9 and a -10. All right, and we can look at another example. And another example would be like k squared plus 4k minus 12. So again, you're going to start with 2 parentheses. For the first spot, what times what gives me k squared? Well, k times k. And then the last spot, I can make my list, my little table, and I can think, well, what times what is -12, but adds up to be 4? So just thinking mentally, I know 3 and 4 add up or multiply to give me 12. So -3 times +4 will give me -12, or -4 times +3. But when I add it up, I only get 1 or -1. So this isn't going to work. I need to find what times what gives me -12, but adds up to be 4. So I can keep going through the factor pairs. So I could try -2 times 6. So if I add those up, oh, I get 4. So I don't have to keep going. This is going to work. So I can put -2, +6. I'm done. So looking at some of the problems from the homework, the first thing we can do to set up our problems is to make the 2 parentheses for each trinomial we're trying to factor. So you can see that's done. That's the first step. And then the second step, we're going to want to go ahead and write out the first term. So the first 2 spots come from that first term, right? So x times x gives me x squared. These 2 first spots come from this first term. What times what gives me k squared? Well, k times k. So that's going to be for every single problem. The first 2 spots come from this first term right here. X times x gives me x squared. X times x gives me x squared. N times n gives me n squared. N times n gives me n squared. So that's going to be my first thing I'm going to want to do when I'm setting these up. And then we can go ahead and make our tables to help us find what the last 2 spots are going to be. So just as a refresher, the last 2 spots come from the last term. So I have to think, what times what is 20 but adds up to be -9? So here I got my little table to show that, and I can start going through some factor pairs. Now we can start off with 1 and 20, but that'll be, when I add that up, that'll be way too far away from 9 to work. So I can think of some others, 5 and 4, but I need a -9. So even though 5 and 4 work for 20, it's not going to work for when I add them up. I'll get a +9. So I have to think, well, a -5 times a -4 gives me a +20, but when I add them up, there's my -9. So this is my factor pair that I'm going to use. And I just go ahead and throw them in. -5, -4. For number 2, the same thing. We're going to just make our table, and I got to think, what times what gives me -54, but when I add up those 2, I get -3. So I'm going to go through, maybe you don't know, so you can look through your multiplication table, and you could see a 54 right there, and it would be a 9 and a 6. But 9 times 6 is +54, so we need to make one of these negative. So if I choose -9, then -9 plus 6, well, there's my -3. That works out right away, and I don't have to do any more, which is nice. So I can put -9 and a +6. In number 3, again, we already have our first step done. I have to think the last 2 spots come from the last term. So what times what is 12, but adds up to be negative 7. Well, I know that 2 times 6 is 12, but that doesn't add up to be negative 7. And I know that negative 2 times negative 6, that's negative 8. That's not going to work. I can think of 3 times 4 is 12, but I need a negative 7. So negative 3 times negative 4 is still positive 12. But when I add them up, there's my negative 7. All right? So that's what I'm going to want to use. Right there. Negative 3 and negative 4. All right. So you're going to notice when we're doing these, on these two problems here, when I had a positive third term and a negative middle term, I'm going to have negative negative. When you have both terms, the middle term and the last term negative, well then your parentheses are going to be plus or minus. All right, and when both the middle and the last term are positive, well then both our last terms are going to be positive in when we factor. The last two spots will be positive. So let's look at 4 real quick. What times what is 72 but adds up to be 17? All right. So you're going to want to look at your multiplication table and think about that. You could see 8 times 9 is 72. And we got to add those up. Well, that adds up to be 17. So first try, it worked out great. So we have a positive 8 and a positive 9. Now I knew these were going to be plus, again, because we started off with a positive middle term and a positive end term. All right. Great. So go ahead and give these a try. Use the tables. As you do this, you're going to find that maybe you're going to need the tables less and you can do it more mentally. So good luck, and if you have any questions, feel free to talk to Mr. Stevens or myself. Have a good day.